What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, talking about patch 14.6. It is probably already live by the time you're watching this video. As this is the patch rundown, I'm going to try to talk less about why we did things. The patch preview, which came out a week ago, is a better spot for that. This is going to be about when math is required, what it's going to be, and otherwise just a good way to give a synopsis on the patch. Hopefully, this can be somewhat more concise. This is me we're talking about. We're going to try all the same. So 14.6 is a relatively large patch. There are a lot of systems level updates to items and overall role power, as well as several champions getting adjustments and buffs and nerfs as needed. Now I'm going to skip past champ adjustments first and go talk about systems changes because they will have a larger overall impact on the game. So we're going to scroll down to two sets of changes. One is an overall suite of buffs to crit marksman. TLDR, bot lane is, as a duo, as a pairing, as a group of champions, probably very slightly more powerful than it should be, but not to a very large degree, just somewhat. But the level of power there on crit marksman compared to the supports, or marksman in general compared to supports, is skewed too much towards supports. So the point here is to buff a suite of marksmen who feel a bit disempowered. I did some spot checks on individual champion win rates comparing 14.1 to 13.24, and the majority of crit marksmen didn't really move, and so I'm pretty confident that the actual power level of crit marksmen in terms of their ability to actually win a game of League of Legends didn't actually change very much. However, the perception of their power level is very, very poor, and so when even coordinated high-level pro teams who are good at peeling for a squishy backliner are typically unwilling to play a crit marksman, then what hope do people in solo queue have? And pretty reasonable to say that even if Jinx statistically wins as many games as she did 3 months ago, let's give the whole suite of champions buffs anyway because they simply don't feel good to play. This is one thing I want to continue to reiterate as the head of the live pod is we are specifically not called the balance team. This is about the live game and the overall fun of the live game. And even if this means crit marksmen are technically overpowered, if they don't feel that way both to play as or against, then it doesn't matter what's technically true. What matters is how the game feels to play. And we will always ultimately be reactive to how people feel the game actually plays, and not just do whatever the data suggests that we do. We're going to care about the data. We're also going to care about player behavior, and through a mix of those, as well as design intuition, make choices here and make changes here. So in this regard, this is buffing specifically the suite of crit marksmen in a way that is strategically unique. I think there is or can be some discussion around what makes a marksman and how should you compare Lucian, Tristana, and Sivir, or a champion like Varus or Callista. That's a whole thing. That's a different topic in a different video. Regardless, this is about specifically late-game crit marksmen and making them good not only as generic, here's a big damage multiplier that should matter quite a bit, but also here you are uniquely better than other roles at killing tanks. We're going to go after things that only crit marksmen buy, that crit marksmen will get a big use out of, and specifically going after mostly late game. In the Quick Blades case, we're just giving it flat AD, which make it more of an early power spike, but then you get to live in the crit ecosystem, and so if you're going to go for that kind of a build, you've got this to look forward to late game. Regardless, this is meant to be a bit of power. Now, mathematically, 10 crit damage is around 4... Actually, we have the math, so flashbang warning here. And we'll scroll all the way down. Mathematically, this ends up being like 4.6% more damage when you crit. This is 2.21 versus 2.15. The relative crit damage ratios here of IE versus old versus new patch. So this is not massively more damage. This is when you have a 100% crit chance, your autos do almost 5% more damage. When you finish IE, you've got 40% crit chance, so multiply this 4.6% by 0.4, and you're getting 2% more auto attack damage when the item comes online. Like, it's not that much more damage, but it is going to be strategically a more interesting thing to say, no, you're going to when you play an IE champion, you're playing to play a late game champion, and trying to stretch out more of the power curves and give more difference in expression to the various marksmen in the game. Yes, there are some early game and late game chance, but the disparity between like Renekton and Kayle is, I don't think, very close to the disparity between some bot lane champions that we see. Even a Jinx or an Aphelios versus like a Callista or something. Anyway, this is kind of the suite of changes here to buff specifically crit marksman. We also, as mentioned, are trying to take some power out of support, and as a somewhat consistency pass, doing it in jungle here as well. We are making Doran's items unique against the tier 1 and tier 2 support items, as well as the starting jungle egg. So look at 20-ish minutes, or 16 on average, I think it is, for eggs. At 16 minutes, when you finish your egg, congratulations, you can buy a Doran's Blade, as your second item. Go for it, have fun. All you if you want it to. As a support, if you want to buy a Doran's Blade after you've gotten all the way up to like Bloodsong or something, go for it, have fun. But this specifically is going to kill the Doran's Blade lane start for supports and Doran's Blade first recall for junglers. The basic reason is Doran's items in current League of Legends are there as a balancing lever for the 3 conventional laning roles, as a counterbalance for the fact that junglers and supports can gank them at any point they want and aren't tied to their income streams. They're not going to lose a turret plate because they roamed, in the case that turret plates are there to say, if you roam for too long, you're going to give up gold to your lane opponent, and it's going to pay for that kill you might have gotten. That kind of happens with counter jungling, but not really. That kind of happens with zoning out the AD carry 2v1, but not really, because if you're good at roaming and good at ganking, you're not actually losing your camps to your opponent. You're not actually losing your AD carry to getting tower dove, right? So functionally, this is all here to say that power exists if you play support and play jungle well. This is here to say you're going to get 2v1'd. Here's a bunch of bonus stats because we're all playing the same champions at the end of the day. This means that, yes, being able to shortcut that intended strength profile and weakness profile is not very good for current League of Legends, where these champions are good at roaming and good at getting these ganks off and whatnot. So you can't do the Doran's Blade start. If you do the Doran's Blade start, you can sell it after getting first blood, which doesn't seem very good. If you want to go for a longsword 3 potion start on Camille support, you can. And I'm sure some players will do that instead of the Doran's Blade start, but that will be worse than the Doran's Blade start. And so that's basically the point here. That's kind of the goal here. That's going to be going on here. This is primarily about the level 1 lane Doran's Ring Rumble, the level 1's lane whatever. That's what's going on here. Okay, so moving on from that, though, we have another nerf for supports, which is specifically their gold income. So I saw some confusion around this. I think the people who did the napkin math did the analysis kind of wrong. So the gold required for the upgrade is getting dropped by 25%. By 20%, right? It's going to take 20% less gold to finish upgrading. That said, the gold that goes into the upgrade is both the gold from minion kill and champion hits, as well as the passive gold per 10. So I ran the math on exactly how long the average World Atlas turns into Runic Compass, which I believe is like 8 minutes and 10 seconds. And if you do the math based on when gold generation starts and when stack generation starts, I know exactly how much gold on average comes from passive gen and how much gold comes from active gen. And so I can math this out and say, oh, we should be nerfing gold income by about 26%. And if we nerf gold income from active sources by 26%, you will finish your quest the exact same amount of time, because you're going to earn, I think it was like 119 gold passively. And it's like, oh, if I'm earning 119 gold passively, and it's still going to take about 6 minutes, then this means I need to earn 400 something gold before is 300 something gold now, and oh look, that's 25% or 26% or whatever. Again, the math worked out. I forget all the numbers. They're on a different document somewhere else. Regardless, this means that we will take those things down. And then for the second one, it goes from, I think it was like 8:10 to like 13:15 or something around here. And it's like, oh, over the course of those 5 minutes, you earn 5 gold per 10. I know how much gold is going to be over the course of time. I know how much gold you're going to actively earn through the quest. And instead of having to earn another 500 gold in the quest, you're going to earn 400 gold in the quest. The amount from passive gen is the same. And so we have to, again, nerf this gold by 26, 27%. And so the math all works out. We'll do the data tables in a second here, but that's kind of the point, is to say that actually you're going to get your quest completion to get your sites at the same time, get your quest completion to get your Solstice Slayer, whatever else at the same time. The difference is going to be that you're going to be, as a support, 200 gold poorer. And so you're going to get your one item spike, your Solstice Slayer, your Zazax, your Bloodsong, your whatever, congratulations. But now you're going to be another roughly 40 seconds later at finishing your Trailblazer or your Imperial Mandate or your Leandries or whatever. Average support gold income after their items is done is around, I think it's 270 roughly gold per minute is the average gold generation per minute for supports once their quests are done. And so if you're 200 gold shy, well, that's right, just shy of a minute extra time being spent here, right? So that's the math out. That's the point here. This is going to be basically pushing back the first purchased item spike by just under a minute. There's also a direct nerf to Solstice Slay. We went after it last patch. We did not get quite the winner magnitude that we wanted, and so taking another tap here to try to get it down the rest of the way. Both durations are decreased to 2.5 from 3 seconds. This thing, by the way, only matters for the health bonus. If you would have gotten into combat and taken damage, because it gives you max HP, which is functionally just a heal. If you're already in combat, you're getting full value anyway. If you're out of combat and you weren't injured, the max health goes back down anyway. This only matters in the 0.5 seconds window of you got extra free max health, took damage, and then that was going to make a difference there. That's, of course, a very, very narrow situation, so it won't really matter here. It's primarily saying, nah, this is going to be less good at making people fast, because it's just the easy tuning lever here in this item. Okay, let's do the math real quick on supports. So here, and actually one thing I want to point out as well, we'll just leave the numbers here, is I specifically, because data that we have actually is if this item turned into a Bloodsong or a Zazax or a Celestial Slay or Celestial, whatever, you know what I mean, right? Per item, per 5 items, there's also one for like didn't upgrade, but if it turned into Bloodsong, how long did it take to turn into Compass, and then how long did it take to turn into Bloodsong? If it turned into Zazax, how long did it take to go into Compass? How long did it take to go into Zazax? If it went into Celestial, how long did it take to go into Tier 2? How long did it take to go into Tier 3? So we have that per support item. If I wanted, I could also get that per champion and dig into even more gnarly data. I didn't need to go into that level of detail. Zazax is basically a ranged only option. Slay is basically a melee only option. Bloodsong's kind of in the middle there. Celestial is somewhat in the middle, but it's skewed towards melee. We know what the user base is. Again, I could have dove more deeply into the data. I took a vaguely surface level look at, like, we're going to use the finished support item as a pretty good proxy into ranged versus melee support item completion timing. And it was very, very obvious that Bloodsong, Dreammaker, and Zazax completed sooner than Celestial and Solstice Slay. So this meant that ranged champions were generating gold more quickly than melee champions were. And so in these nerfs, we specifically nerfed ranged more than melee. And I specifically nerfed PvP interaction more than PvE interaction, which is to say that if you are getting your gold through roaming and, you know, it's Maokai, I bought my boots, I'm going to go fight over this Rift Herald, or these grubs, I should say, and I'm going to earn, right, 30 gold 3 times from my, you know, big proc damage. Okay, well, that's disproportionately nerfed. And, you know, Jan doing the same thing is disproportionately nerfed compared to I'm sitting in lane playing like AD carry, we're 2v1ing, I'm last hitting minions here. So if you are playing in lane support, you're actually going to finish your item a little bit sooner. And if you're playing out of lane support, and specifically if you're playing a ranged support, you're going to complete your item more slowly specifically. It's also worth noting that, like, the relative ratios here, right? Like, Janna's going to trigger this way more often than this. Maokai's going to trigger this only a little more often, or maybe not even more often than that. And so in terms of the degree of the nerf here, right, it's bigger for range than it is for melee because ranged has target access. Again, specifically noting that the support items are getting completed sooner on ranged champions than on melee ones, and so this is a disproportionate nerf toward ranged champions. Also, because it is a flat 200 gold decrease, this is probably going to be a bigger nerf towards champs who are more gold scaling. I want to point out one thing, which is outside of a case where we really, really had to, which is the case of Karma, we elected to skip on support nerfs this patch, support champions this patch, because we wanted a cleaner data set to measure the impact of these kinds of changes. That Gianna was actually on the docket for nerfs this patch. She was the #1 support for us to nerf, and we held off because we wanted the clean data set to say, what does this really do? Like, are we actually seeing with a 200 gold drop, and we get to look at every range support, every melee support, like, do we see Alistair gain 1% win rate because he cares about 200 gold that much less than other champions? And that gets harder to do when Alistair's bad matchup is Janna. Janna gets less popular because we nerfed Janna, and it's like, well, now it's harder to dig into the data and get enough sample, and it's just like, it just makes it way harder, right? So we intentionally skipped on individual support nerfs unless it was really required. In the case of Karma, this was kind of Fallout here, but that was an intended thing here. Okay, next we have epic items to talk about here. TLDR, I realize I spent a lot of time talking about why. I'm going to try to get a little bit more concise here. The point with the epic item changes here are to make epic items not meaningful power spikes. That these are all items that build from a 400 gold component and a 400 gold component and a 200 gold combined, 350 gold component, 350 gold component, 250 gold component, 150 gold combined. Phoenix Codex not far from that as well. Glacial Buckler actually gets a slightly nicer build path here in this patch, but basically it's a bunch of roughly 1,000 gold items that are Root to Spectral which I'll talk about in a second, that are basically going down in gold efficiency to preserve legendaries as the primary thrust of gold efficiency. That's the TLDR. Your completed items are going to be any different, but this is going to mean that first or second recall is going to have worse power spikes here, and lanes are going to have much more similar power levels in early laning phase. That a serrated Dirk recall is not going to be nearly as powerful because, 1,000 gold minus 5 AD is a pretty meaningful power down. There's a small Root to Spectre's Cowl. Technically, it's losing 50 health, but it's getting the regen all the time. It's overall going to be more regen straight up. It's going to be a little bit less health, but I think in general is going to be relatively normal as an item. Steel Sigil gets a better build path. Brutalizer gets a pretty small hit. Tunnel gets a small hit. Very, very small buff. Not a ton more to say here, except that, yeah, these are going to be some nerfs overall. One more change is that Void Grubs are going to get a Decaying Heal instead of a Shield, which is going to essentially make it very obvious that what their real health is for things like Smite. That's the entire point here to do that. Okay, so those are the system changes, right? We are raising the power of Crit Marksman. We are lowering the power of supports primarily through Gold Income, but a couple of other individual tweaks here, skewed towards ranged champions in particular. We are lowering early game, early lane power spikes, the epic items. Obviously, if you're like 2.5 items and you've got Yomu's and, is it called Opportunity? I want to say it's called Opportunity. And then you buy a Serrated Dirk that's still minus 5 AD at 2.5 items as well, right? Like this is going to be on aggregate power level down, but disproportionately felt in the early laning phase to say that lanes aren't going to snowball until you hit Legendary. Obviously, being up items is still being up items, but the degree to which you're winning is going to be lower. Alrighty, let's go to the top now and talk about individual champion changes. So, up first, Briar is simply too performant in lower MMRs. We are trying to find nerfs that disproportionately nerf low MMR play. Don't mind giving her back a little something that is skewed towards high elo play, where you drop a ward, jump over wall. Hey, cool, good job for you. But hey, it is minus 1 to 5% attack speed on W. I'll have the math for you in a second. This is a 1 to 5% healing decrease on the W, and a 0 to 100 damage decrease on the R. Let's talk about this with all the math as we scroll back to the top. So this is the attacks per second for Briar with her W active. It is not a very, very big deal, but auto-attacking is a very large portion of Briar's total kit output, of course, and specifically auto-attack DPS is a larger portion of her lower elo damage. So this by itself should be a low elo skewed nerf. We're also taking, again, 50 to 100 damage off of the R. Lower elo games tend to go longer, so she's more likely to reach this rank 3 ulti. Although, again, on average, games are going to end around this point in time. But still, it's some damage down. This thing can land in an AoE. Low elo players are worse at spreading out and not taking the multi-hit. It's going to make her a little bit less bursty. It's not going to be a ton of win rate loss, but this is going to be a little bit of power down, specifically in a low elo skewed way toward Briar. And then again, talking about the fact that she's going to get some less healing is going to mean some as well, as she's certainly healing quite a lot now. We move on to Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath is getting a pretty decent set of buffs here. Ultimately, there are several old Heartsteel users who are not doing very well because they no longer hard bind to Heartsteel. They're not getting really extreme amounts of damage out of the item. I think unbinding it with the champions is a good thing, but the overall champions are kind of weak, so Cho'Gath is one of several tanks who is getting some strict buffs here. Feral Scream is actually correct to max second, but people tended not to do it, but it is quite good. Regardless, they're maxing it last, and so a really, really substantial cooldown increase to a good amount of damage, good amount of wave clear, and a good amount of CC that he's going to have a lot more access to for pretty much the entire game. The average game ends around this level, and so even a normal end game is still going to receive a buff to this ability. As far as the total damage on E, it is going up by, I believe it's 5 per hit per rank up. So this is 3 per hit per rank up, I should say. But still, as you hit it multiple times, you get a pretty decent amount of extra damage increase here as you're getting functionally plus 9 damage per rank up here. And here's what you're getting, right? It is a pretty solid amount of damage that you're getting pretty early on by maxing it by level 9. And this is increased wave clear, this is increased trading damage. This is just Cho'Gath does more damage as melee into melee, has more crowd control as melee into functionally melee. He's going to be much better at fighting other melee champions, as the top laner tends to do. Quite a bit of decent power to Cho'Gath. Diana is a fairly balanced mid laner and a pretty critically weak jungler. So the first pass here is a fairly low scope set of changes that is meant to be very, very power neutral on mid and give a quite meaningful amount of jungle clear and PvP power to jungle Diana. So mid Diana gets 0 bonus attack speed anywhere in her itemization or rune choices. She tends to run Electrocute, doesn't run the attack speed shard, she's just very, very bursty. And so any attack speed ratio buff functionally doesn't buff Diana at all. This is essentially power neutral via the attack speed ratio buff, and this is roughly power neutral considering the attack speed buff here as well. The only real buff that mid Diana is getting is if she does go Nashor's Tooth, she's going to get some more power out of this, congratulations. But also the fact that the buff duration of the passive get increased from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. Now that is a very, very big deal, especially early game, when your cooldowns are so long that you can't get up at all times. For jungle Diana, she's strictly getting a lot of power from this. This multiplies against her stat shard, Legend Alacrity, and Nashor's Tooth, all of which come online very, very early in the game. Additionally, this matters a ton for her early clearing. This will make Diana probably top, I don't know, maybe top 5 champions for level 1 leashless clear. This is a very, very big deal, and this really does mean a lot. Unfortunately, the 3 seconds part was actually hard-coded in our tooltips, and we needed more lead time than what we had for localizing that, just because it requires going into literally every single tooltip and then updating it, and there's often enough for the localization team to do. It's going to update next patch. It's not going to be very difficult, but doing it the right way means hooking it up to a variable that we can code elsewhere, and that just there is room for mistakes when they're under the gun and have very little time until the patch actually comes out itself. This change ended up coming in fairly late into the patch. So regardless, let's talk about the math here. We're going to start with what it means for mid lane Diana. So if you're a mid lane build, your passive attack speed is up on average about 1%. When you have the active on, it's up closer to about 2%, and of course it's on for longer. So if you are queuing to take a very long form trade in mid, I don't know how many long form mid trades take longer than 3 seconds, but if it does, if you're really running them down, then you're getting the attack speed bonus here. If you're pressing Q to wave clear to punch the wave for 5 seconds, you're getting a buff there. This is going to be some amount of win rate to Diana mid, but again, it's 1 to 2% more attack speed, and then you get your empowered state, which if you compare, 1.3 to 0.9, this is obviously 30% more attack speed or so for an extra 2 seconds, which of course does matter. If we look at her jungle build, which is with a attack speed stat shard and an early Nashor's Tooth and Legend Alacrity, you're seeing more like a 4% baseline attack speed increase, with closer to about a 5% active attack speed increase. Actually, that's not true. It's about 4% here as well. But again, the core difference being that the active buff duration is increased by 2/3, which really, 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 really matters for your first couple of clears, where you can't always perfectly cycle all your cooldowns. This will definitely, hasten her clear by several seconds. This definitely increases her PvP power by a decent amount, considering that, again, this is a champion who is core building Nashor's Tooth. Just straight up having about 4% more auto-attack DPS is a big deal. When you do this to a conventional marksman, this would be 1.5% win rate roughly in just PvP damage. Not to mention the fact that this will increase her jungle clear, which is direct gold income and XP income, plus the fact that we're, again, not really mathing out the duration increase, which matters a fair bit here. So should be a pretty big deal. And of course, if Diana is still under 2 next patch, we can just do jungle Diana buffs, and that's fine. But this is the first stab at fairly low scope changes that should hopefully make her auto-attack-centric builds feel better. We move on to Gallo. This is not so much a balance change as a change aimed around getting his builds to be tankier, getting him to build AP bruiser items like Cosmic Drive, like Rod of Ages, like Liandry's Torment. So the big thing is a partial refund on the passive if you land a spell hit on a champion or an epic monster. Every 2 spell hits is going to reset your passive instead of it scaling naturally with ability haste. Those are going to trigger spell effects, so it's going to trigger things like Liandry's for you. You're going to have attack speed while it's up, which is going to make the attack come out more quickly and let you cycle into more spells more quickly. Again, not affected by haste, but because you're getting oftentimes 2 casts per rotation, there is a base damage decrease that is relatively small, and an AP ratio decrease that is also relatively small. Let's do the math here on the passive. If you're only ever hitting this ability once, you're losing between 5 and 25% of the damage off this ability on a fairly eventually high AP build. But if you're getting 2 hits, it is clearly way, way, way more damage. Look at an example, maybe 2 item situation here, and you're losing 100 base damage, but you're gaining more than 200 back if you're ever hitting twice. So as long as you're hitting twice at least 1/3 of the time, which you are, this is strictly, I don't want to say strictly, this is win rate positive to Gallo if you are getting this to trigger twice at least 1/3 of the time, and that is just going to be the case. That is going to be true. There's another change that is lightly power positive to high rotation builds as well. Again, the desire to be tankier because you can be in the fight for longer and thus get more rotations out. The more just living is a damage stat, the more living is a stat you'll want to buy. And so lower cooldown on Q, but slightly lower burst damage on Q. We can do the math on this as well. Here is the damage of just the Q1, so we're not even counting the tornado damage, which wasn't nerfed in any way at all. And the damage is down 2 to 4%, which is pretty trivial, pretty negligible. The cooldown, however, is buffed by 2 to 12%, which is a very, very big deal. This is very clearly a win rate positive change to Gallo. This is clearly a win rate positive change to Gallo. Gallo is indeed getting stronger, especially for his current builds where he's building Glass Cannon. Now we move on to the things that are actually going to nerf him. So Shield of Durand is getting a 5% reduction on the damage reduction, on the magic damage reduction, as well as getting a 1% AP ratio decrease, and a 4% magic resist ratio decrease. However, it is gaining a 1% per 100 bonus HP ratio to make items like Liandry's, Roa, and Cosmic Drive more appealing. It's also, I forgot to do the math here, it's also going to lose 0 to 20, which is in actual practice 0 to 60 base damage on W when fully charged. I did not include a data table here for this one, but you know, the numbers are of course there. So what does this mean? Well, let's look at his current normal 4-item build, and his DR never recovers. So making up for the fact that he's getting a better Q and a better passive, he is getting worse W damage reduction, and he's getting worse W damage. But if you are going to build healthier items, you're going to build a Roa, you're going to build a Cosmic, you're going to build Leandry, you're going to build these kinds of items, you're going to break even pretty quickly. This is around like 550 health. So this is like finish Roa, have a Doran's Ring, have your scaling health shard, which you already have, consider running Overgrowth as in your secondary rune slots, and, you know, finish Roa and let it start stacking, which is, you know, you're going to finish Roa more like level 10 or 11, don't get me wrong, but this is not that unreasonable to go for. You add a Cosmic, you add a Liandry's, and even as you're still getting a ton of ability power and that ratio got nerfed and the base damage got nerfed, you are clearly make up for it. Again, you're still losing some W damage to make up as well, but hey, this is, if you are going to build health, there's suddenly an appetite, right? The one other nerf to make up for the room is minus 15 flat damage on Justice Punch. It's still a very aggressive AP ratio, and as a small make good here, because the individual hit wave clear on the passive went down, the minion damage reduction is being dropped a little bit. So what happens here? Here is the PvP damage on Gallo on a high AP build, down early, but, you know, pretty trivial late, minus 15 damage. But hey, the minion damage ratio is so much nicer that it's a really, really good wave clear tool. This makes up for the passive losing instantaneous damage, but otherwise, yeah, he's going to be kind of okay here. So overall, what this means is Gallo is going to be a little less bursty, unless he can swing 2 sets of his passives together by making sure he's getting the passive down before whiffing both of W and E only to get into range. So it's like if you E into range and then auto and W, cool, you get it. If you're Eing to land W, you're not going to get the double reset, but is that going to happen, you know, more than 2/3 of the time? We'll have to see. Anyway, those are the changes mathematically to Gallo. We have a nerf to Gragas. Gragas is overperformant in top lane in elite levels of play. He is extremely elite skewed. Yeah, I mean, he's still good at high levels of play, so we're going for nerfs that we think are going to nerf him in higher levels of play, which is his early lane unassailability. He's quite tanky. He has very, very high sustain. We'll see if we can tap that down a little bit. So 30 base health is 30 base health. 0 to 20 mana cost increase on the Q is exactly what you think it is as well. Which is basically just, yeah, he's a little squishier. He has, you know, more mana cost here. What it really means, though, is basically this. So this is not counting any items. So we are undercounting, or I guess overcounting the magnitude a little bit here. But his base health before and after, again, slightly more assailable in the early lane. The other change, though, is that his health regen per minute, because of the passive, also goes down due to having less health overall. So not only is he going to be squishier to burst, he's going to be a little bit more pokeable, which means if you are going to all in him at like level 5, he has 30 less base health, but also 10 less health per minute every single time he was clearing, which across the course of 5 minutes or so, like if you're only going to do a level 6 recall for some reason, this would be, you know, 80 less health. It's, you know, 1 fewer spell or 2 fewer autos you have to land before the champion dies. This matters sometimes. It's not going to be huge, but it's going to nerf his win rate to some degree. But also, the bigger one is, or another meaningful one, is the Q cost going to 80 flat from scaling down to 60. What this means in terms of casts until if you let his mana regen go for 3 minutes, is once you are at the kind of the peak, you're getting 5 fewer casts of Q. This could definitely matter. in terms of his ability to safely wave clear and not be assailable in turret, is that no, if you're not willing to right click to last hit or get into melee range to last hit, you can't just Q to kill your waves. You are going to run out of mana, you are going to run out of health, you are going to be assailable here, so it's just not so trivial. This probably doesn't make him a 50% win rate elite top lane champion, but that's not the goal. He's so elite skewed that he probably deserves to be 51 or so, because he's going to be like 47 or something in lower MMRs. And, you know, in terms of making Gragas not troll your teammates in lower MMRs, he's going to end up being one of the better performant, you know, top laners in elite level play. That's going to happen unless we severely reshape his kit, which is not on the cards right now. We move on to Karma. Karma's an interesting case where there was actually substantial build optimization available before we ever buffed this champion. If you go and look back at her builds in 14.1, she wasn't doing Malignant's Cosmic Drive. Now, don't get me wrong, Malignance itself actually got buffed several times since then, and of course Karma herself got buffed as well, but Karma was secretly always better than she looked like she was back in 14.1. As players have all jumped onto her optimal build, obviously she's gained even more and even more power. What it comes down to right now is the degree to which Karma is able to spam RQ and get her ulti back up is simply too frequent with how much haste is available for her to buy now that players have actually realized that haste is a really, really good stat on her. And so for now, it is unbinding some of her haste scaling by nerfing the passive and nerfing the R cooldown a little bit here. We are tweaking her mana to skew towards support, and we are making Q more expensive as a second nerf towards mid lane as well. So what this comes down to is the mana changes end up being a nerf to mid lane. This is, of course, a nerf to everybody, and then this is a buff aimed at support. So let's talk about it. This is how much mana regen she gets over the course of 3 minutes, plus her base mana as a mid laner. It's functionally no different, right? This is technically green, but like, oh man, 6 mana over the course of 3 minutes, who cares, right? This is functionally no different, so it's whatever. This is a wash. As support, though, it's more meaningful, right? It's 100 mana. This is like pretty late game, right? But it's a bit more mana. It's you know, 1 more spell cast to make up for the fact that there are mana nerfs elsewhere. Is this huge? Not really, but it does at least move the needle and shift towards support a little bit here. It's a pretty free lever, so we throw it out there and say, here you go, Karma. You get a little bit more power and support compared to what you get in mid lane, but it's not that big of a deal. The next thing, though, is the mana costs on Q going up from a flat 45 to 40 to 80 based on rank. Now, mid lane Karma is going to cast Q basically on cooldown for wave clear. Support Karma is not spamming Q on cooldown. She's going to cast it when she has the room, and she's not going to get Nautilus hooked in a trade. Or her R is up, but it's up, you know, slowly enough because, you know, the rank 1 spell hasn't had a cooldown change anyway, that she's not going to be ooming anytime soon. And in fact, a lot of Karma is going to be putting only 3 points into Q, and a 15 mana cost increase is not that big of a deal, and then maxing E anyway, and so she's not even going to feel this mana cost nerf that badly. It's obviously still going to be a nerf. This will be win rate negative to support Karma, but not nearly as much as it is for mid lane Karma. Regardless, let's say you are actually maxing Q first. What happens here? Well, for mid lane Karma, by level 9, you are getting far fewer casts on a full mana bar. Almost half as many, right? This is a pretty big deal. This definitely matters quite a bit. Of course, she's going to have a Doran's Ring. She's going to have a mana flow band. She's going to have Lost Chapter and then Malignance. Like, she's going to have a bigger mana pool in actual practice, but that's why a mana cost doubling as opposed to like her mana pool getting smaller is the bigger change here, because she's always going to do something on her mana pool. That's going to be normal. This, like, technically, by those change, like, nerfs mana flow bands regen a little bit if you were going to be low on mana. The math works out that way, but regardless, it moves in that direction. In this case, we're actually not even counting things like Imperial Mandate, which support Karma is pretty willing to buy, and so it actually gets even greener than this if you're doing more supportive items on the champion. But you talk about how many fewer casts you're getting, and it's not quite so severe for support. Again, this is, I'm not, you know, trying to lie. This is still a nerf for support as well, just a lesser nerf for support. And again, it's even less bad than this if you're getting things like Mandate. Finally, we have R cooldown as well as the amount of shielding coming out of R plus E. So if you have 50% ability haste, which is just a made up number, mid lane Karma gets like 120% actually under ulti in like a full build. Support Karma only stops at around like 40 or so. Like, it's not actually that much. It's like Transcendence, Boots, and Malignance, and you kind of stop around there. Just because you don't often get that many items in support. Whatever. Regardless, she like doesn't run ulti 100 specifically on support typically. Anyway, yeah, with a moderate amount of haste and you get 2 refunds on your R, what is your cooldown before and after? And it's not that stark. Like, it matters, right? This is a meaningful cooldown difference on 2 refunds. But if you're at like 100 haste, you're not getting instant resets anymore. It's a much more meaningful change at high levels of haste. I didn't run all the numbers here. I did them when I was, you know, contemplating the changes, but regardless, this is still a bigger nerf for mid than it is for support, though it is a nerf for both, don't get me wrong. And then the one actual buff for support is a pretty meaningful increase to the R plus E shield. Level 16 is entirely fake on support. It's never going to happen, so it is just strictly green for R plus E cast for support Karma. Now, I want to be clear, this is still win rate down for this champion, right? Like there's not enough here to say that this is making up for all the other nerfs on support karma, but it's just a bigger nerf on mid karma. And honestly, depending on where the win rates actually go, if support karma really, really sucks, we will just buff her next patch. But these were changes aimed at mid karma. Are these enough to put her power level in the right spot? Does she require more work to get her to where she needs to be? Or is it going to be acceptable and mid karma is going to be fine? And then what's the fallout there? Let's go see what we can measure. Let's get support karma into a good spot, which we will do next patch if she needs it. If she doesn't need it, then we're chilling. If this ends up not mattering, if this doesn't matter, then hey, you know, this doesn't up compensation, then sick. But I expect we have to buff support karma, and then we will. Right now, red cane still kind of sucks, and blue cane is a little bit OP. So here's a strict red cane buff and a strict blue cane nerf. It is an AD ratio nerf on blue cane ulti, as well as base form cane. A strict max health enemy max health ratio increase on red cane's Q, which hits twice, and then also a just flat nerf where you can't cast Tiamat or really any items. All items are locked out during cane Q. This is non-negotiable. This is correct for League of Legends. I actually looked at red cane builds, and for the average player, Sundered Sky is actually a winninger option than Profane Hydra, and Eclipse actually looks really, really good. I think optimal red cane build is actually Eclipse and skip Profane anyway, skip Profane anyway, and just simply receive free win rate off a Q buff, and you're not going to notice any nerfs, period. That is the actual best red cane build, and it's going to be completely fine for the vast majority of players. Blue cane, of course, too strong. This is a pretty big nerf here via Profane Hydra, and then, of course, a nerf with the AD ratio here as well. So red cane Q damage, this is again per hit, but hey, your primary damage tool going up by 6% damage is a very, very substantial buff to red cane. I think this is a lot of power. This matters a lot, especially if you just switch over to not doing Profane Hydra builds. You're going to be totally fine, and you get strictly more powerful. If you're playing blue cane, here is the amount of R damage you're losing, as well as the Profane Hydra interaction, which of course matters quite a bit as well. And yeah, it's a meaningful nerf to blue cane. We are getting a strict buff to Ornn, buffing the E cooldown by 2 seconds at rank 1, and he normally maxes it last, and so he's getting it for a very, very large portion of time. Ornn is not in a terrible state, but getting 2 seconds off of your sort of, I would say, primary CC tool, I guess. W auto is probably more of a primary CC tool, but still, this is a very meaningful tool all the same. Should matter a lot, getting 2 seconds off this cooldown. We have some bug fixes up to Rek'Sai. Rek'Sai will now always hit her R target, her right click target when she's burrowed. So this was functionality that she had 2 patches ago that's been re-added here. Even if you're out of range of your target, out of the circle, you have like a melee W on you or an RFC, which you're not going to buy, but whatever. Additionally, Void Rush can now be queued up from outside of cast range, some QOL, as well as a bug where it would actually break if you were stunned the immediate frame after starting to cast R. Basically, re-scripted the entire startup flow of the spell, and it should be fine now, but yeah. Moving on to Senna, this is just the very standard bot lane Senna thing. I actually want to point out, we are doing a different change to this one in 14.7. We discovered a bug where essentially when a support was executing minions for her, she was acting as though she hadn't last hit the minion, where the intended functionality is for her to act as though she had. That because the support items changed, it was sort of an oversight to not realize that her script relied on referencing a specific item, not generically the support execute buff. And so because of that, this functionality broke, and so she was getting way more souls than she was supposed to. She gained 4% win rate or something in 14.1, and we didn't track down the reason why. It wasn't lethality items, it wasn't all this other stuff, it was actually just she was getting way more souls. And so for now, for this patch, we have this change. And next patch, we're going to revert the number back to where it was. It's going to be 8.4 or something, but we're going to fix the bug where she was getting essentially full souls from her support executing things for her. And so that'll put her back to the soul rate that she had back when, and should be a pretty reasonable win rate, and so we'll measure it again there. But yeah, this is probably going to be around 2% win rate of soul drop. We've used this lever many times before. We use it as a very easy, bespoke AD carry versus support nerf. We will never pick a number and sit on it, because the point is not to have a theoretically perfect support Senna versus AD carry support, soul drop rate. It's there as a balancing lever, and will always be a balancing lever. This is not the last time this number is going to get changed. Shen is getting we're not sure how big of a buff this is because we don't change his passive cooldown very much, but essentially this is giving linear scaling to Shen passive, and especially buffing him in the early and mid game in terms of his reset ability on the passive overall, giving it linear scaling instead of bespoke scaling. Here's the data table on the level of reset he has, and you can see the biggest resets are sort of around here. When you look at it in terms of a remaining cooldown on the spell, you can see the sort of the biggest numbers, you know, where it starts like an 80, it starts with 80 or so, or 70, is here in the mid to late game, or sorry, like late laning phase through mid game toward end game here. Early laning is going to get a little bit here. The ability to, you know, cast 2 spells and get the reset right away is, you know, more pronounced levels like 2 through 5. Ultimately, it's more shields for Shen, pretty meaningfully more shields for Shen. This, I think, can be a pretty delicate lever. If Shen moves like no win rate, we'll just give him a different buff, right? Our goals are to make Shen more powerful and trying to find things that are interesting and stand out for Shen, and this is a lever that makes him a very good 1v1 duelist. We're buffing the 1v1 dueling power of Shen via his selfish shielding. If that's not enough, we'll do something else. We'll give him some other form of power, but we're trying this for this patch. Scion needs quite a bit of help. His win rates are not great. He needs probably at least 2% of win rate, maybe 2.5, maybe 3, but that's maybe stretching it here. Regardless, we are giving a lot of late game to Scion because his kit reads like he's a late game champion, but his win rate curve does not suggest that in any way at all. So we're basically giving him a little bit more a little bit more late game Q damage. This breaks even at champion level 5, and then it's just a buff from 7 onwards, which is most of the game. And then we're basically strictly buffing Soul Furnace. So here is the max. Just using as an example here, the numbers are pretty much the same no matter what you do. The max damage on Scion Q before and after. This is technically, yes, a little bit less damage in the early game, but pretty quickly it's break even, and then it's just better late game. This, to be clear, is a 75 becomes 80% AD ratio, so it's 7% more AD scaling. So the value of Eclipse or Titanic Hydra or Hullbreaker or Sterix Gauge, the AD on that is about 7% bigger. It's okay, the autos are the same, the R is the same, but Q is like half of all of Scion's damage, and that scaling is 7% stronger by the time you're building these items. Is that a huge change? No, but it is a move forward to say that, hey, you can build a little bit more AD and you're going to feel a little bit better about it, to say, it's my turn to carry, I'm going to go do that. In terms of the max health stuff here, essentially the way the math works out, by the way, anytime you have a max health ratio and a base, this actually tells you should build armor and MR. Now, the lower the base is, the less this is true, but functionally, armor and MR are just better stats if this is the way your ability scales. Not as it works this way, Signed works this way. If you have flat plus bonus health, you have to do the math to know which one's which. But it's why I'm a fan of just, here's a percent max health ratio. It's ambivalent what you buy. You can buy health, you can buy armor, you can buy MR. They all have the same functional impact on buffing a shield. Anyway, this says that, hey, we're a little bit closer toward health being a good stat for you. This is, of course, not a change until champion level 8, but once you get rank 2 of W, as long as you have 1,000 max HP, which is literally impossible not to have just on base stats, you will simply have a stronger shield than before. And that shield can be stronger to the tune of 15 to 20% if you go into mid to late game. Now, 5,000 health level 18 is the extreme late game here, but it means that the extreme late game of Scion can have 20% more to his shield, which is pretty meaningful on a cooldown that can be cast twice per fight, and if it doesn't break in time, you can recast it for damage. The fact that this is a bigger shield means, again, you are getting the damage half of the spell more frequently because it won't get broken early. That can do quite a lot here. This can be very, very meaningful, and so I don't want to undersell this because I think it can do quite a lot here. But hey, if it's not enough, if Scion isn't strong enough, we can give him more buffs. That's not a problem. We move on to SMolder. SMolder has nerfs, basically direct nerfs this patch because the perception of SMolder is wildly out of line with the actual power level of SMolder. He is certainly a little OP, but he is not highest ban rate in the game OP. He is not actually that level of strength. I think at literally every MR bracket, Aurelion Sol clearly wins way more games, as just like an example of a champion who also scales and specifically outscales Smolder, and even in high elo wins more games than Smolder does. Regardless, this means we have to very strongly go for, again, he is OP, so we have the budget to just simply nerf the champion. That's completely fine, but we especially want to go after perception here. And so the biggest thing for that is going to be this Q, where the execute threshold is getting hit really, really hard, especially late game. Also, the execute check is going to fire much less frequently. It's going to, I believe this ticks once per second. So it's only going to check for an execute every time the actual passive deals damage, or the Q burn deals damage, or really any Smolder. Like, Smolder's E will make him check, but if you just Q and then walk away, this will only check once per second. But it will only check after Smolder damage, not after anyone's damage. So like if a Diana combo comes in, it's not going to come in the middle of that and jack a kill. So the math and the execute is actually very, very meaningful. At 225, the base execute was 7.65. It's a flat 6.5%. If you got into, later ports of the game, like 350 or so is not unreasonable. So you can get to the point where, like, yeah, you're actually executing at like half the value before. Now 400 change is very, very high and probably unrealistic. But this does clamp down his uber late game power quite a bit. And it says, no, my execute is here. It is better than Collector. It is going to check every time I deal damage, and I will get more kills, and I'm not going to buy Collector, obviously. But I'm not going to steal my teammates' kills nearly as often. We're not going to spam the sound effect and particle effect nearly as often. And just the fact that this is not going to check for an execute nearly as often means that champions will literally live longer. Not only will they not be executed at higher health, but they, might not even be executed at all because someone will just do the rest of the damage there. So this is a pretty big deal in terms of total damage throughput, and because you're going to see the Elder Dragon themed execution explosion far less frequently, I think that will do a lot for the perception of how much late game this champ is doing. Missile radius on W goes down by 10. Bonus move speed on E goes down by 25%. Both these should be pretty meaningful in terms of him making him less escapable as a scaling AD carry. In terms of poke being less reliable and having to rely on other tools somewhat and just getting sort of free damage a little bit less easily because this felt a little bit too generous, and so I'm glad it's going down. Trindamer gets a very simple change on paper. 0.5% attack speed growth tends to be about 1% win rate for someone who's very auto-attack heavy. It's a 1% win rate to Tryndamere. Nothing much to write about here. This is going to give him some better late game. Volibear is a pretty balanced top laner and a quite overpowered jungler. We're going after tools that are jungle skewed here. This is going after Qmax, which is Qmax first is what jungle Volibear does, and it's not what top lane Volibear does. It's max second, so it'll have less impact on Voli top, as well as just the access of Q is, of course, a jungle skewed lever. And then early R cooldown is something that a jungler can use more often because they have target access more often, and they're going to tower dive more often, whatever. So these are, nerfs that come in at level 4 and level 6, and cap out at level 9 and then fall off by 11 and fall off entirely by 16. These are nerfs to Volibear. He's a bit too strong. He's going down a little bit. Not a big deal. We're going to talk about systems changes. That's the patch. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.